The question is that this bill now be read a second time, and I call the member for Hotham.
Acting Deputy Speaker, like all MPs, I have spoken to literally hundreds of people about the bills before us today. And one of the most common reactions that I have had from people is confusion and perplexity. Why would a government take the most from the people in a community who can least afford to pay? Why attack at the foundation institutions of our nation like Medicare and the age pension? Why implement a university funding system that will stop working-class kids who could be the first in their family to go to university of dreaming of higher education? And what I am realising is this. Our Treasurer, Joe Hockey, and our Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, they don't get it. They just do not get it. Their lives are so divorced from the experiences of the ordinary Australian, the experiences of a person who lives in my electorate of Hotham. Let's have a look at some of the numbers. 82% of the cabinet that created this budget went to a private school. In my electorate of Hotham, just 14% of residents did. Most of these cabinet ministers went to university for free or on very heavily subsidised HECS. And you know what? They are going to ask students in my electorate of Hotham to stare down the barrel of $80,000 to do nursing at Melbourne University. The income of a senior cabinet minister is around $7,000 a week. Do you know what the median income of someone in Hotham is per week? It's about $518. That means for the ordinary person in my electorate to make what the Treasurer earns in an hour, they need to work for almost 2 full days. Now, we're learning a lot about the Treasurer at the moment. We're really getting to know him as a public. And many of you would have seen his performance on Q&A a couple of weeks ago. He was asked how he kept in touch with the lives of ordinary Australians. And in response, he told a story about his family history and how he went from rags to riches, how his parents came to Australia and built what they have through hard work in the private sector. Now, I'm very admiring of that story. I'm very admiring of Australians who've come here with very little and who have managed to build something from nothing. The critical point here is that all this Treasurer knows is his own life experience. It's a very aberrant life experience, and that's what he believes is all that he needs to know about the Australian public. And this really explains a lot to us. It explains the genuine incredulity of a Treasurer who can't understand that a $7 GP co-payment for every family member, for every time they go to the doctor, is a significant sum. It tells us why, instead of listening to the concerns of Australians, Joe Hockey would suggest that those struggling spend less of their money on beer and cigarettes. It's comments like these that show us just how completely divorced from the ordinary Australian this cabinet is. So I wanted to take the opportunity this morning to talk to the House about how the budget will affect ordinary families who live in my electorate of Hotham. I'll talk about some key areas of change. We couldn't possibly cover them all in 15 minutes. But I want to tell the stories of some families that I know and how they'll be touched by this budget. And I want to start with health, because of all the things that are done in this budget, it is the health changes that will affect every single one of us in the Australian community. Bulk billing in my electorate is very high. It's a working class electorate by and large, so about 82% of all doctors' visits are bulk billed. The $7 GP co-payment will see almost $6 million raised each year in additional tax across my electorate. That's an additional $6 million collected from sick Australians by this $7 GP tax. It's regressive, it's unfair, and one of the best things that I'll be able to do as a first-term Member of Parliament is vote against its implementation in this House. And for the Treasurer, who is so confounded and so frustrated in his lack of understanding of how anyone could feel that such a tax is unfair, I want to tell the story of a constituent of mine called Danny. Danny was born with some significant health problems. He suffered as a child from kidney reflux and he was quite ill as a young person, but he managed to complete university and find a job. Later in his youth, he was diagnosed with brain cancer, and the surgery which saved his life has left him with significant short-term memory problems. Danny battled on, he found a job and got married, and then later very sadly lost his wife and his unborn child to cancer. His kidneys packed up and he was forced onto dialysis at night. But it was an expensive period for him and he had to remortgage his house. Eventually he was able to get a kidney transplant and he now works as a forklift driver and managing a warehouse. He's on a lot of medication and he requires significant and frequent medical treatments. He pays $139.70 for medication a month. With an additional $25 imposed by the government for his drugs, he will face an additional $7 per month for pathology reports, plus an additional $7 per month per each doctor's visit. They're monthly, but sometimes more. Danny earns about $500 a week. He works, but he struggles, and the changes to this budget will see him struggle more, a lot more. It's so unfair that it's Australians like this that are being shouldered with the burdens. Let's talk about education. We're very lucky in Hotham to live in quite close proximity to Monash University, and so almost a third of my residents in Hotham are students at one level or another. And boy, will they be hit hard by this budget. There's the billions of dollars of cuts in school funding, the cowardly back down on the supposed unity ticket that we went to an election on the Gonski funding that would see for the first time in Australia school funding follow the children with the greatest need. And then there are the changes to university funding. And, you know, as I've had the chance to really think about the budget changes over the last couple of weeks, increasingly it's the university changes that are making me the most sad, because it's university education in Australia, in this modern economy where skills is really what matters when you go out into the workforce. It's university education that provides us social mobility in this country, and I just can't fathom how a government would make changes that are going to so much affect Australians, particularly those in families in lower income brackets. Now, the Coalition has argued that young people from lower socio-economic backgrounds won't be more affected by the changes. This is inane, nonsensical, and completely lacks common sense. It's absolutely out of step with the research, which shows that students in lower income brackets are affected by fee changes all over the world, and we've even seen that in Australia when changes have been made to HECS over time, and how, in fact, almost 100% of enrolment changes have been from students in lower income brackets. Now, I've spoken to a number of school principals about the changes to education and how that will affect students in their schools. And one conversation struck me in particular. I called a principal who runs a very good school in one of the lowest income parts of our electorate. It's also one of the most multicultural parts of our electorate. And honestly, when I talked to this principal, he was genuinely devastated by the changes that are being made to higher education, because he and the teachers at that school work so hard to try to make a culture of excellence and help these students who come from sometimes quite difficult backgrounds to believe that there's actually a hope that they'll be able to go on into higher education and go into a professional background, which many of them dream of. He is the principal of this school where a lot of the students come from families where they're from cultures where debt is very unusual and you would never normally take on debt. They're brought up in households where they're already under pressure to go out into the workforce quickly after they finish school so they can help bring in income for the family. And I'm quoting here, he said to me, "For these families, a sum like $100,000 is a Tats Lotto win. Remember, these families have a family income of $40,000 or $50,000. They rent their homes. Their kids are already under pressure to get out into the workforce quickly and contribute. Of course, this will make a difference." We talked about some specific students, but one of the biggest imposts that this principal is concerned about is around the impact on culture. How can he try to build the sort of culture of excellence that he wants to see in that school when university is effectively being put out of reach for many of his students? And for people who don't believe that these impacts are real, I really invite you honestly to come to Hotham, to come down to this school and to talk to the principal and to talk to some of the students. I know that life in Warringah and life on the North Shore perhaps don't reflect these realities, but they're the realities of electorates like all of us here in the chamber at this moment. I would be very remiss not to talk a little about the changes to pensions. I have about 23,000 residents in Hotham who are pensioners, and I think actually they have probably been the most virulent in their opposition to this budget. And to be fair, the pensioners are contacting me not just because of changes to the pension, but they're so worried about things that will affect their own grandchildren and some of the changes that they see, which reflect very different opportunities and life chances that they feel that they've had as Australians. So ACOS has estimated that pensioners will lose about $80 a week by 2024 due to their payments being linked to CPI. So there's obviously an income impost here. But what really frustrates me about this pension change is what this is saying about our country. What it's saying is that by linking the pension to CPI instead of to wage growth, what we are saying is that as our country grows more prosperous, that there's no need for us to really share that prosperity with aged pensioners, that they should stay basically living, and many of them struggling, on those same incomes despite the wealth of other Australians increasing. This just doesn't reflect the way that we do things in Australia. As a nation, when we grow, everyone should benefit. That's just how we do things in this country. There are also changes to the pension age that are going to really have a significant impact to people in Hotham. About 35% of my electorate who are in work in blue-collar jobs. Shifting the pension age, it arguably could be workable for people who work behind a desk, who spend most of their time in white-collar industries. But, excuse me, for manual labourers, it's a rough change. It's an extremely rough change. Increasing the pension age to 70 will make Australia the highest pension age across all of the OECD countries. Interesting, because I think we have the lowest debt level, or is it one of the lowest debt levels at least in the OECD? And again, Labor will oppose this change, and I'll be very proud to stand up for the older Australians in my electorate who rely on the pension. There are so many of them. Before I close, I'll just make some brief comments about the impact of this budget on women. For women, and in so many ways, but for women in particular, this budget absolutely fails the fairness test. Some of these measures will impact very disproportionately on women. I'm talking here about female students who will pay significantly more for their education. It's women who will usually pay the price of losing family tax benefits, and lower income, no surprises, given the values in this budget, will be the hardest hit. An unemployed single mother with a 8-year-old child will lose 12% of their income as a result of this budget. All of us have single mums in our electorate, and we know that these are the families that are watching every dollar. Can you imagine? 12% of their income will simply disappear. A single income couple with 2 school-aged children and average earnings will lose about 6% of their disposable income. Again, these are families that in many instances are struggling a great deal, and for any of us, dealing with a 5 or 10% sudden reduction in our income is going to be very difficult to manage. For women at work and women trying to balance the cost of childcare, the freezing of threshold and indexation for childcare, rebates and fee relief is going to have a fast impact, and for a government that is supposedly so concerned with the participation of women in the workforce, I see this as absolutely regressive and contrary. And just, if you're interested, have a look at the numbers for education, because the impact on women is absolutely shocking. A woman who does an accounting degree at Melbourne University will pay $120,000 for her degree. That'll include $45,000 in interest, and if she takes off the usual amounts for part-time work with kids, she's going to be paying off her degree for 36 years. How can this be considered fair? I'm absolutely staggered. One of the best things about this budget, though, is the significant empathy that I have had for other Australians who are concerned about the impact on their fellow Australians. I've got more and more stories that I could share with you, but I just want to tell you that a Mrs. Swallow contacted me. She was contacting me, acknowledging she's comfortably off and won't be affected by the budget, but is worried about those who will be. Janine, another constituent, stated the budget wouldn't impact her personally, but she's deeply troubled by what it will mean for those who are struggling. These are people who don't want to live in a society which make it harder for people like Danny, for people like students in the low-income school. They don't want to see those kids get a second-rate education. They don't want to live in a country where families have to make tough decisions about whether or not to take their kids to the doctor. It's ridiculous. This is life in Australia. It's not what we know and expect, given we're one of the richest countries in the world. It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to so many Australians, and that's why I'll be fighting with Labor as hard as I can against the changes that we've discussed. Thank you.
I thank the member for Hotham. The question is that this bill now be read a second time, and I call the member for Bass.